Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Well, the fire engines are on their way. Just tell me how many floors you got there.
It's the fourth floor.
Right,
All
okay.
right, quick.
Fire and that's getting bigger and bigger. People are gonna die and I'm scared.
I sort of feel a bit guilty that I'm here living and doing all this stuff when obviously they didn't get a chance to live and, do stuff that they wanted to do at such a young age.
That was the night of the 14th of June 2017 when Grenfell Tower in West London went up in flames. You heard the voice there of Luana Gomez, who was 12 at the time. She managed to escape with her sister. Her brother died, the youngest victim of what was a terrible night. Today, Luana's family and the near 600 other survivors, bereaved and local people heard the findings of a report into the causes of that tragedy.
Those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants. All contributed to it in one way or another, in most cases through incompetence, but in some cases through dishonesty and greed.
Well, that was Inquiry Chair Martin Moore-Bick delivering damning remarks alongside his report today. 72 people lost their lives in the fire that started 5 minutes before 1 a.m. in flat 16 of Grenfell Tower. Within 20 minutes, a vertical column of flames had already reached the top of the building. Grenfell Tower, we now know, was covered in aluminium cladding which acted to spread the flames. Residents calling 999 were told to remain inside, a long-standing policy of the London Fire Brigade, a policy which we now know contributed significantly to the death toll.
Well, the public inquiry, which reported today, says that the tragedy was the result of a catalogue of failures by government and the construction industry. It lays out how those failures by policymakers, contractors, the local council and fire brigade all contributed to the extent of the disaster. The report says that warning signs were missed as far back as 1991 following a separate fire at Knowsley Heights in Merseyside.
The report follows years of testimonies which laid out a string of failings that shattered lives in a low-income community living in one of London's wealthiest boroughs. But justice, prosecutions over the failings, if they come, may not happen until 2027, a full 10 years after the fire.
And in the meantime, thousands of people are still living in potentially unsafe properties. As of the end of July, more than 4,600 residential buildings with a height of 11 metres or more had been identified as having unsafe cladding. Remediation work has been completed on less than 30% of those buildings. Well, joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's Jack Sidders, who specialises in property and in the building industry here in the UK. We've just been listening to Sir Martin Moore-Bick and also to the Grenfell United conference, that grouping of survivors and campaigners. It's obviously been a hugely difficult morning for them. What are the main conclusions, though, of this report? We heard something of what Martin Moore-Bick had to say.
It speaks to the length of time that this report has taken, is that it's hugely sweeping in its breadth, and it paints a picture of a litany of failure at every single level. Some of that failure, as Martin Moore-Bick said, was about incompetence. Particularly, you look at the building industry, the contractor, the subcontractor, the architect. All of them had technical failings. But there was also dishonesty in the manufacturing, in the way that these materials were marketed and sold. There was the roots of the failure are traced back to the government, as you alluded to, right back to the 1990s. I think Martin Moore-Bick himself said the failure to amend in an appropriate way the statutory guidance on the construction of external walls, that is where the seeds of the disaster were sown. So every single body that was involved in this and has been examined as part of the inquiry comes in for some form of criticism, some of it much more scathing than others, including the fire brigade who had fingers pointed at them in the initial report. It's recommendations there mainly around training and so forth, but clearly the ultimate central point here was the failure of the material, and that is what caused the fire to spread so rapidly. But then every other aspect also failed around it in terms of the response.
And the report talks about an attitude of complacency and criticism, as you say, of the council, the tenant management organisation which ran the estate, and, as you mentioned, the fire brigade as well.
Yeah, quite. I mean, there was a sort of a history of antagonism in the run-up to the fire between the TMO and the residents, which didn't help. And I think, actually, when you take a step back and examine what happened here, in relation to the failures of Kensington and Chelsea, this is one of the wealthiest boroughs in the wealthiest city in the UK. This estate is surrounded by some of the most expensive houses in the UK, and it really, what it speaks to is a real stigma about social housing, the lack of care and diligence by various authorities to properly do their job, to properly enforce regulations. There's a section in the report all about coming up with a proper fire safety response, and there were drafts and drafts done, but it wasn't that that particular detail was included. Said it'll come in another draft, and the work was simply never completed. So it all just speaks to this, a very sort of lazy attitude at every tier.
Yeah, and the Grenfell United conference reflected upon that it was, as the lead said, our loved ones, our neighbours and our friends who suffer the consequences of that. In terms of what this means for the industry, for the building industry, we mentioned that even all these years later, there are still many, many buildings that have this unsafe cladding. What do you think is going to be the response now, and has been, if you put it into context, the response already of the building industry to this disaster?
Yeah, quite. And I think it's important to bear in mind, really, that's actually the whole purpose of this inquiry. The reason for taking this very methodic, very long-term process. And I know that causes a huge amount of frustration for people who want to see criminal convictions. But the whole purpose is to root out the cause of this and ensure that it never happens again. And a huge part of that is, as you say, around the building industry and its approach to technical training, expertise, the importance of that, because that just failed again and again. And then clearly now solving the issue that's been left, or that's been unearthed as a result of Grenfell, is hugely complex. And it's clear that, and it's been clear over the last few years as that response has emerged, that we lack the expertise, the resources, the people to inspect, and then there's all the questions around whose responsibility, who should pay for this work. It's huge. It's hugely difficult, but it's the result of 30 years of failure.
Well, I also wanted to pick out some of the things that Morbik highlighted in his press conference, which were some very big recommendations, a long list of recommendations, and also ones that you can imagine are going to be very significant. For example, an overarching construction regulator, bringing all the responsibility for all fire safety under one government department, fire engineers, a lot of recommendations. Are they going to be accepted as a whole? Can they be implemented?
Yeah, as you say, I think it's 57 recommendations in total. And this is a vast body of work. And actually, to your point about are they going to be implemented, one thing that really struck me from the recommendations is that there is a recommendation in there that where the government doesn't implement recommendations that come up in reports like this or in coroner's reports, why not? And it needs to give a detailed explanation of why it hasn't done this, because actually a lot of the issues addressed by the recommendations in this report aren't necessarily new. These are issues that have cropped up in the past. There have been fires, luckily not as bad as this, but there have been similar types of fires in the past, and it was clear that the learning was not taken forward and that change was not implemented as a result. So
lots to do, lots of urgent stuff to do in the meantime. But why have criminal convictions been so slow to come? It's likely to be a full 10 years before people are in court over this.
Yeah, so I think possibly a useful comparison here is the Hillsborough disaster. For anyone not familiar, stadium disaster, which that took 30 years in the pursuit of justice there. So what happened was when then Prime Minister Theresa May decided to set up this public inquiry, that took precedence, and then the initial Phase 1 report raised additional questions, which then took longer as a result for this Phase 2 report to finally come out. And Martin Morbik himself said today it had taken longer because the scale of the failures and the issues raised was bigger than they ever expected. But in the background, there has been a team set up to evaluate the potential for criminal prosecutions. This inquiry has thrown up vast amounts of evidence, and that evidence can now be used. So what will happen now is that public prosecutors will evaluate what, if any, are the most appropriate criminal charges to pursue, and then criminal charges can be brought. So it's not that work hasn't started in any way, but the work of the inquiry takes precedence. So by its nature, it has to follow on after that.
Yeah, indeed. And that's what the survivors and families and friends and relatives had called for now as a result of this report, for that prosecution work to be taken forward by the Crown Prosecution Service. We should end, as Michael Morbick did, on Chapter 9 of this report, which is about the families and campaigners and their own experiences, which have been documented in their own words, what they have said as a result of this.
Yeah, and it's hugely, hugely harrowing reading, and and the audio that we had at the start there, it's very difficult to listen to. And actually, even to that point, one of the panel members who was speaking at the press conference talked about her own experience of working on this inquiry, and she was visibly moved. She was in tears as she was, making her concluding remarks. So it is absolutely fundamental to remember, as Martin Morbick said, this is people's lives, this is their loved ones, this is their homes, these are very, very, very personal tragedies.
Jack, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Bloomberg's Jack Sidders, who specialises in property and the building industry. As we come to that major conclusion of a significant inquiry in the UK, Martin Morbick's and his whole team, after years of work and more than 600 interviews with individuals as a result of the Grenfell Tower, trying to get to the bottom of what needs to change to avoid that sort of tragedy again.
Yeah, and still thousands of people living in unsafe buildings, which are still yet to be fixed, still yet to have that cladding removed from them many years after that tragedy, those awful hours of that night all those years ago.
Yeah, the Grenfell United Conference, of course, saying that they want to send a message to Keir Starmer that the government has to break old habits and implement all the recommendations of the Grenfell Tower inquiry resulting today. You've been listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo. Our audio engineer was Sean Grastamakia. I'm Caroline Hepker.
I'm Yuan Potts. We're back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.